Thank you, President. And I have the privilege of introducing our two speakers today, both dynamic leaders in our community. And we talked about how last month was Women's History Month, and it's not just that month, that it's every single day that we need to be appreciating the phenomenal women that are among us every single day. And here are two that I want to talk about and present or introduce to you all. We have Alexis Knox-Miller and Danielle Summerville, who both hold very similar positions. Danielle is with the City of Colorado Springs, and she is the Director of Equity and Community Engagement. And I'm probably sure a lot of other fill in the small blanks there of things that she'll be kind of being a part of. And then Alexis Knox-Miller, as you heard, an educator, a career educator, and recently was hired in District 11 as our equity director. And we are building out that department as well. So a lot that they're going to speak to is really about the responsiveness of who we are as a community. And just to their opening remarks today, beautiful words. You know, we're becoming an increasingly diverse community. And I think as we prepare ourselves for our future of who Colorado Springs as a community is going to become, you know, having the likes of the two presenters today are going to be absolutely critical so that we become our best. And so, again, my privilege to introduce the two of them, and they will be co-presenters today on the topic of equity in Colorado Springs. I'll turn it to the both of you.
Hello, everyone. So we are going to start our presentation, A Journey Towards Equity, Creating and Sustaining Ecosystems of Equity. Next slide. So first, we need to define the work in the terms of equity and understand that there are key differences between equity and equality. Equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need in order to enjoy full lives. Equality is trying to give everybody the same things in order for everybody to enjoy full and healthy lives. The problem with equality is that there's an assumption that everybody is starting from the same place and they need the same things, and that is not always true. Thank you. Next slide. So for my purposes, I also have a definition of educational equity. I do want you to pay attention to the graphic in the back because it's a great graphic and it helps you understand what equity actually looks like in education. So on the frame in the bottom, you see the little kiddo with the apple tree. The apples are very easy for him to access. And then on the other side of the tree, a kiddo needs a taller ladder to access those apples. That's what equity looks like in our schools. The other frame where you see justice, where they've kind of inherently straightened out the tree, that's where I'm hoping we get to in D11 in all public school systems, is that we are not having to knock down barriers, but that we inherently straighten out our systems so that we have a justice orientation. So basically, equity in education is removing barriers, allocating resources, providing training, and doing what is necessary to ensure that all children have access to the same outcomes. Next slide. An expanded definition of educational equity, and this is very important, is that when we are educating for equity, we are raising the achievement for all students. So a lot of times people like to think about equity as this kind of zero-sum game. If we give something to this group or if we give something to that group, somehow I'm going to lose something. That is not true. We're raising everything for everybody. The achievement should raise for all of our students when we're educating for equity. But we are also narrowing the gaps between the highest and lowest performing students, and then eliminating the racial predictability and disproportionality of which students occupy those highest and lowest achievement categories. Next slide. So some national trends. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these trends point to why there's a need for positions like Danielle's in mine. You can see that in 2017, 12.6% of African-American children had asthma compared with 7.7% of non-Hispanic white children. You can see that Native American students perform 2 to 3 grade levels below their white peers in reading and mathematics. They are 237% more likely to drop out of school and 207% more likely to be expelled from school than their white peers. You can also see down at the bottom, like there's inequities in healthcare. Non-Hispanic Black women and non-Hispanic American Indian and Native Alaskan women experience the highest rates of pregnancy-related mortality. And the numbers there, you can read all of those, but we really have to be aware of what's happening in our society. And we have to make those trends and those outcomes more equitable for all because it impacts every system that we have. Next slide.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Alexis. So for the city of Colorado Springs, equity in the city of Colorado Springs is committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion, both in the workplace and in the community. And as Alexis stated in the previous slide, it really shows the rationale behind why it's so important for municipalities to support this understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion in government. Alexis had a wonderful slide to show you equity and versus equality in education. And I just wanted to share this slide. This is one of my favorite slides, because what this really defines is that if you look on top of what is equality, you could give everyone the same bicycle, but clearly giving everyone the same bicycle is not fitting the need of the individual. And so what equity does is it looks at the individual and what is the individual need to be successful and to participate within community. And then it adjusts accordingly. And so you can see on the bottom graphic how now we have bicycles that are suiting to the individual's needs and not just equality. And it's very important to know that distinction, because oftentimes equality and equity are used interchangeably. And I think this graphic just really points out that they are two very different concepts. Okay, so why it matters. In Colorado Springs, these are demographics that are taken and they go from 1980 up into 2017. What you start to see if you look at the trends is that over time, our racial and ethnic demographics in Colorado Springs are changing. And what you'll see is that amongst the Latino population, we continue to see increased growth. We will continue to see that growth over time. And there are actually some studies out that show that by 2050, America will look demographically much different. And we're actually going to move towards where there's more multiracial individuals who make up and comprise the United States and not just one particular ethnic or racial group. But you can see here in Colorado Springs how we're trending. You can see within the Black population that there has been a pretty even number represented amongst the Black population. Asian or Pacific Islander, we continue to see pretty steady increase. The same with mixed race or other, and the same amongst Native Americans. But what this is showing you is that we as a community are becoming more diverse. And as we become more diverse, we need to make sure that we are really attuned to what are the cultural differences and needs within our community that we need to address. But in saying so and recognizing that we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, what we're seeing in the city of Colorado Springs is that ethnic and racial diversity is really comprised of 2 zip codes here in the city. So when you look at 80910 and 80916, which is known as Southeast Colorado Springs, that is where you see the highest concentration of ethnic and racial diversity in the city of Colorado Springs. So it really is concentrated. And what that just goes to show is that when you think of Southeast Colorado Springs, there are some things that you also tend to notice, such as what are some of the attributes of Southeast? Does it tend to have lower socioeconomic status? Does there tend to be a higher call for services from police and other services? And so we have to take this into account because there's intersectionality between race, economics, crime, education, and all of those factors have to be held as one conversation. You really can't have one independent of the other.
So in Colorado Springs School District, this data is probably a couple of years old at this point. We enrolled, you see here the amount of students we enrolled. Our demographics were very, very similar to the demographics of the city. We're probably the most diverse district in the city. Yeah, I would say next to Harrison too. So just really quickly, you see that we have 1% Native American, 2% Asian, 8% Black, 32% Hispanic Latinx, less than 1% are Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, 2 or more races are at 7%, and white equals about 50% of our school district. I want you guys to think about those enrollment numbers as we're going through the rest of these slides, because this is piggybacking off of Danielle, why this work matters, because there's some very obvious trends of what's happening in our school district. Next slide. So chronic absenteeism is defined as missing more than 10% of the school year for any reason. In our district, we have a 9% chronic absenteeism rate, 6% elevated chronic, those are the kids who are having absentee plans, and then 18% are highly chronic, for a total of 33%. Those are our district numbers. When you look over to your left at the chronic absenteeism graph, you can see that all of our students of color have very, very high chronic rates. And what this tells me when I look at this data is that there is something happening within our system that we have to interrogate, that there's not probably a sense of belonging or a sense of trust between our students of color and our school system, and that there's some work that we need to be doing. Next slide. Here's our discipline data. And this is where those demographic numbers become really important. So in the 2019-20 school year, we had 12,926 total incidents placed into queue. That is our learning management system that we place referrals in. Of those, 5,591 were repeated disobedience incidents, and 4,960 were detrimental behavior, and 1,193 were other violations. I call those out because those are the codes that we use that are super subjective, and that points to that kid rolled their eyes and I didn't like it. So this is talking about kind of the cultural differences that we are having between really our majority white teaching force and our kids of color as our city changes. If you look at the graph, the gray piece of pie represents our Black students. Our Black students represent 8% of our district, but they make up 15% of our discipline incidents. This becomes another question in which we have to interrogate our systems. Are our Black students just that naughty? Or is there something else going on in our system that makes them almost double their population? Everybody else is pretty proportionate to their racial demographic makeup in our district. Next slide. Discipline continued. You can see that our boys are making up 70% of our discipline incidents, and I think they only make up about 50% of our population. Our students who are on free and reduced lunch, that's how we indicate poverty in our school system, are making up 64% of our discipline incidents. Our minority students altogether, when you aggregate for that, is 59%. And then students who are not in the GT program are making up 84% of our discipline incidents. So we have some inequities across the board in our discipline. Next slide. And here's the achievement data. And this is the data that always breaks my heart, because reading, writing, and doing math when you leave school is so important, and it points to a lot of different outcomes. We know what happens to students as far as being jailed or not making as much money or not having great healthcare. All of those tie into these passing rates. So it's very aggregated. It's not broken down by grade band level like elementary, middle, or high. But if you took a test, if you took an ELA, math, science, or social studies test, your scores are in there. And some of the things that just really jump out to me is that really Black students across the board are not doing well. They're some of our lowest performers. I see Native American students, 0% in social studies. Our Hispanic Latinx population is not doing great either. So we're turning out some students. For example, Black students, 12.6% of Black students in D11 passed math in the 2018-19 school year, which is very problematic. That means, over 80% of our students, closer to 90, are not able to do math at the grade level that they're in. Next slide.
Okay, so for the City of Colorado Springs, I began in my position in October of 2020. And so my position is really an expansion on work that has been occurring in the City of Colorado Springs in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so part of my strategy, because I am the community-facing outward staff member who works on working with our diverse communities in a number of ways. And so part of my strategy has been to really go out and listen and learn from marginalized members of our community. What are their current experiences with the City of Colorado Springs? What are their interactions with different systems that they engage with on pretty much a daily basis? And how can we improve upon those experiences? And so from listening from a variety of stakeholders, to include organizations such as the Hispanic Chamber, the Black Chamber, meeting with members of our Native American community, beginning to meet with members of our AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community. What are their experiences? And of course, starting in October, a lot of that experience has to do with systems such as COVID vaccination, and making sure that our members of our diverse and marginalized community have access to that information about COVID testing, COVID vaccinations, and safety, and making sure that that information is given in a way that is received by that community. And so sometimes we tend to operate from a majority community standpoint, and we have to be able to recognize when there may be a language barrier, when there may be transportation barriers, and we have to be able to address to make sure that we are being equitable to all members of our community. Also, fostering collaboration. So as a city entity, it's very important for us to make sure that all members of the community feel like they have an equal space here in community. My firm belief is that government should be interactive, and it should be something that happens in collaboration with our residents, not something that happens to our residents. And so that means sharing out opportunities such as our boards and commissions. We have several boards and commissions that are volunteer based, and making sure that members of our diverse population know about those opportunities so that they are able to join the boards and commissions, and making sure that their voices are also being heard. And ultimately, what you'll see come from the City of Colorado Springs is a citywide diversity plan that is created with input from residents here in Colorado Springs, because we could go out and try to mimic a plan that's been done in another city, but it won't work. Colorado Springs has to create a plan for Colorado Springs. And so that is something that I am tasked to do. Some of the focus areas as I've been out meeting with members of our community have really been on these 4 key areas. That is economics and the economy. Is everyone engaging in the economy in the same way? If no, why not? If yes, how can we continue that? Public safety. There was great, social unrest within the nation last year, and here in Colorado Springs, we also saw protests. And so how are we able to have conversations with community members about their interactions with law enforcement, about careers with law enforcement, careers with the fire department? And there's an commission called LETAC is what we call it as an acronym, but it's the Law Enforcement Transparency and Accountability Commission. And it is a 13-member commission that is working to understand better how our residents are interacting with law enforcement and making recommendations on that. Also, as Zach touched on, housing is a large conversation that I'm having with communities as well, whether or not housing is affordable or attainable. And as Zach already touched upon, the prices are rising. And so that impacts different communities very differently. And when we already have communities who are struggling, and they're primarily communities of color, the struggle becomes even greater as the housing prices go up. And then transportation. When we have opportunities for employment throughout Colorado Springs, does the full community have an opportunity to engage in those economic opportunities, or is transportation a barrier to them being able to reach some of the newer opportunities that may exist within the city? And how can we be responsive as a municipality to the needs of all residents here in Colorado Springs?
Right. So we passed an equity policy on May 27th, 2020. Our board adopted this policy. Some of the key points of our equity policy, and I must state that we are the first in the region to have a written equity policy in a school system. And some of those key points are allocation. We're looking at how we are equitably allocating our human and financial capital. We're going to promote and facilitate opportunities for our staff to improve their cultural competency and cultural accountability. We're going to review all of our practices, procedures, and programs that result in over or underrepresentation of certain populations, and then we're going to stop those practices and procedures and policies that result in that. We're going to utilize our hiring practices so that we have a diverse hiring pool and talent pool for teachers and everybody within our system. And then we are going to collaborate together so that our students are sitting in front of teachers and in front of administrators who are culturally responsive in their pedagogy. Next slide. If you would like to see the full equity policy, that tiny URL will get you right there. Also, if you Google D11 equity policy, it'll pop up, or you can go to our D11 equity page, which is d11.org/equity. Next slide. So laying the foundation for the work. We passed our policy in 2020. I was hired in July to begin this work. And then we opened up an application for community members within the D11 community to be a part of our district equity leadership team. They're beginning to work on operationalizing that policy and looking at key goals and practices that we should have within our district. And then after that, we started with a group called the Bridges Collaborative, which is through the Century Foundation, which seeks to integrate schools through socioeconomic status and racially, and ask that we create these ecosystems of equity that we talk about in our policy with the city, and using housing as a leverage to do those things. And then finally, in October, we hired the American Institutes for Research to complete a comprehensive equity audit on our school, so that they can tell us which is our school system, so that they could tell us in which ways we are not equitable and help us to become a more equitable system. Next slide. And our future plans are what's happening at the end of April. Our equity audit is starting to take shape. The data is done, which is super exciting. We're going to have a co-interpretation process where a lot of different community stakeholders will be coming into the room and speaking with us about our data. We'll implement some of the resources from our consultants, and then we'll have a scale-up plan. We will start having school level equity teams. There will be professional development. We'll be creating this equity guiding question document that helps our whole district to have a lens of equity, so that I am not only the owner, so that is everybody's work. We will have some Board of Education and Executive Cabinet training, because we believe in District 11 that we can only grow as high as our leaders can. And then there will be a Department of Equity and Inclusion build out, so that, again, I'm not siloed in this work and there are folks helping do this work. And then we want to leverage our academic master plan and our facilities master plan to sustain ecosystems of equity. Next slide. And I will not read this whole quote to you, but I do love James Baldwin. And what he says is that, you know, he's talking about justice and where we need to look. And I will leave you with some words from my consultants. We have to look at the most vulnerable amongst us, whether it's in our school system or if it's in our city. And we have to not, we say don't lose the forest for the trees. In this case, we want to see the sickest tree that we have in that forest, and we want to tend to that tree. And that's when we can say that we are truly equitable. Danielle, any final words?
No, thank you, Alexis. I just want to reiterate what Alexis said, is that this is a community effort. When we talk about the work for equity, diversity, and inclusion, it cannot be done by a handful of people. It must be done by all people. And so we all play a part in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and making sure that this community is accessible for all residents who choose to live and survive and thrive in Colorado Springs.
Outstanding. I loved every word. I was hanging on every word. I appreciate it. I'm clapping for you. Everybody else should be clapping too. Like, dude, this work is not easy work. And I think that our city is changing in such a way that they are putting the right people in those positions. And if the positions don't exist, they're creating them. That's the cool thing about being in charge, right? If it doesn't exist, create it. Just make it. Put worthy and well-qualified people in those positions and let them go to work. Thank you, my sisters. I appreciate you.